Welcome to or welcome back to Wrong Sports, and this next video is going to be a continuation of college football firsts, as I'll be going out of the country for these next few episodes. Previous episode of the series, I covered college football and the first games that happened in Cuba and Japan, and the first games between two American schools that happened in Japan in 1976. But a few months before that, in 1976, there were two other small colleges that went on a football tour around Europe, and that is where I will be going in this third episode of College Football Firsts, International Journeys, for the first games that happened in Europe. But before I get to that, make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below. Also, make sure you share this channel with other college football fans. I really want to get up to 1,000 subscribers in the next couple of months. Also, as always, like and share this video, and as always, you can check out my social media, my podcast, and help out the channel on my Patreon. You can find those links in the description below. But first off, before we get to the actual series of games, I have to mention an even earlier game. If you look up when the first American football game in Europe happened, you have to go all the way back to 1897 in a game between, and bear with me here, my French is not that great, École des Beaux-Arts versus Académie Julian. That wasn't the best, but those are the two schools that were involved in this, and this game was set up by Robert D. Farquhar. He was a Harvard grad, also an MIT grad, before he went to France to study in Paris as he studied architecture there. Farquhar may have played at Harvard, but I don't really have too much record of the time of him playing, but he clearly knew of the game, or he might have been an alternate on the team, because records back in the 1890s were slim at best. But it's clear that Farquhar knew the game because he was the one who organized this game, as he had other American students that were studying in Paris at the time play in the football game to celebrate Thanksgiving and sort of have a little break during the 1897 holiday. Farquhar would be the captain and the quarterback during the game, and the other 24 men that played in this game were all alumni of American schools like Harvard, Penn, and MIT, and there were also some players in this game that did have football experience. So I guess you can say this is considered to be the first American football game that was played on American soil. The game did end in a 0-0 tie, and I don't have any pictures of the game, nor do I have stats, or really anything that happened in the game, just that it ended in a 0-0 tie, and there were 400 people or so that showed up at the racing club in Paris to watch the game. But the game was mostly for the American students in Paris at the time, as the French really had no idea of this game at this point. After that early game of American football in Europe, there wouldn't be another one, or at least another hint of American football in Europe, until the late 1960s, as the NFL, which were looking to expand its product, but not in the US, but abroad. Since Canada wasn't really an option, they started to look across the Atlantic to spread American football. First, the NFL had sent players to tour American military bases and hospitals during the Vietnam War, which got the league some press worldwide. That would lead to their next try, which was sending 42 American players abroad to demonstrate American football, or an Americanized version of rugby. Some of the players in this game included Dan Pastorini, Matt Snell, and Merlin Olsen, and they would demonstrate their game on May 27, 1972, in front of 8,000 people in Paris. Now, this wasn't really a real game, as it was mostly a scrimmage, as they mostly did some plays and showed off formations to the crowd to try to educate the audience on the game. Score wasn't kept either. And even though there weren't a ton of people in the stands to watch this demonstration, the league would still discuss the possibility of having a European league. And 2 years later, that would come to the public. On June 5, 1974, at the NFL headquarters in New York, it was announced the formation of a new football league called the Intercontinental Football League. Along with that, the possible IFL teams were also announced, as there would be teams in Munich, West Berlin, Vienna, Barcelona, Rome, and Istanbul. Some of the cities you will remember had NFL Europa teams in the 90s and early 2000s, but American football at this point, and even rugby, wasn't very popular throughout Europe. So to try and educate this new audience, the IFL and the NFL thought of a mini tour around Europe, predominantly in the cities I mentioned, to teach the people about the game. But to do this with professional players would be expensive, so the organizers looked to amateurs to play in this tour. You would think the IFL would try to get D1 college players from the NCAA, but they couldn't do that, as the NCAA was going through a ton of changes in the 1970s with different divisions like Division I, Division II, Division III, like we have now. So the IFL went to the NAIA. If you don't know about them, they are basically D1 college sports, as they give out scholarships, but schools are much smaller than the D1 NCAA and even D2 NCAA schools. But the main thing is they are completely different from the NCAA, and the NAIA were known to be the first to do a lot of things, like to stage the first National Collegiate Basketball Tournament with schools all around the nation 2 years before the NCAA started theirs, which we now know as March Madness. The NAIA also had integrated teams in their tournaments before the NCAA did, and they also did a lot of good in women's sports before the NCAA did. And since the NAIA was and still is different from the NCAA, they were looking to do something else before them, and that meant using 2 NAIA schools to play for the Europe Cup on this 5-city tour. The NAIA and the IFL would co-sponsor the trip, which would be 5 games over 3 weeks, stopping in Berlin, Germany, Vienna, Austria, Mannheim, Germany, Nuremberg, Germany, and Paris, France. And since the Intercontinental Football League wanted to survive, they wanted to show the best teams, not just bottom feeders from the NAIA. So the NAIA went out and chose their best 2 teams from this year, which were Texas A&I and Henderson State out of Arkansas. These teams were ranked 1 and 2 at the end of the 1975 season, and they played in the national title game in America in 1975, but would now travel 10,000 miles and find out who was the best in Europe in a best-of-5 championship. But before they could kick off, there would be many hurdles for both teams. First off, this trip would be happening in June, which is not only the off-season for football, but for school too. So that meant that the teams would have to come back to campus during the summer or stay there after the school year ended to practice and train for this once-in-a-lifetime trip. Another concern came from other teams in the NAIA, as they were annoyed that the top 2 teams that year were picked for the tour because it gave those teams a lot of press as well as extra practice time before the season. This concern was quickly shunned by the Texas A&I coach and Texas legend Gil Steinke, who said that injuries could happen during the practice and during the tour, which could hurt his team for the upcoming season, as the tour was only 2 months before the regular season started, and his team was on a 2-year-long winning streak. Another concern was for the student athletes, many of which had summer jobs and internships, and now had to give those up if they wanted to go on this European tour. They also wouldn't be financially compensated because of the NAIA amateur rules at the time. So basically, if you wanted to go on this, you had to give up working for 3 weeks, maybe even more. And if you had an internship, you pretty much couldn't do it that year either. You had to basically give that up for another year too. One more concern was that this was scheduled and promoted as a series of exhibition games for a European Cup. But in actuality, it was a test for the European market to see if they would like this new game and would be willing to pay for it in the future. So really, with more pressure to promote the game than to actually win this European Cup, that meant that both of these teams wouldn't be doing a bunch of pre-game strategy. That was because they were told they needed to put on a show for this new market. And once again, according to Texas A&I coach Gil Steinke, he said, "The IFL promoters and the NAIA wanted us to pass at least 50% of the time, and they preferred that we throw from a drop-back pattern. They've also asked that we run basic defensive patterns, and the objective of the game is to excite the fans. To the seasoned football fan, tough defense, good faking, and a veer offense are exciting, but the fan who is just learning the game wants to see the football being thrown, and not really anything else." So after hearing all of that, both teams weren't really concerned with the outcome of this tour. They were just looking to enjoy the trip, get there, and also not have any injuries. But the troubles would start, and they would start pretty early. First off, the 2 team groups traveled on a charter plane to Europe, but due to the amount of players and the amount of equipment, the weight of the plane was forced to do 2 stopovers at 2 airports, and the stops would continue throughout the tour because of this. Both coaches would say that the logistics of moving 2 football teams, complete with coaching staffs, trainers, managers, and administrative personnel through 3 European countries, was an adventure in itself. But both teams were able to get to Europe in late May 1976, and they would start off in Berlin, actually West Berlin, That was because Germany was still split at this point, as the Berlin Wall split the city in half. Starting off the trip here was pretty much a once-in-a-lifetime thing for all of these players, coaches, managers, and anyone else that was aboard those planes. But another thing that they were shocked by was that there were adoring fans who were interested in this new game when they got to West Berlin. At least 9,000 fans would show up to their Olympic Stadium in West Berlin to watch Texas A&I win the first game of the European Cup 17-8. After that, the teams would move over to Vienna for Game 2, as they would play in Prater Stadium in front of 18,000 fans on June 5th, 1976. I don't have a lot of info or really any pictures of this game, but the final score was 21-7 in favor of Texas A&I, and now Texas A&I were leading the series 2-0, as both teams would move back to Germany for these next games. And the next two games in Germany were mostly for U.S. servicemen, so I don't have a crowd estimate, and I don't think many of the locals went to these games really either. The third game was in Mannheim, and Texas A&M scored a 20-6 win, and then the closest game of the series happened a few days later in Nuremberg, as Texas A&I won 17-15. This series was pretty much over, as Texas A&I were up 4-0, and there's only one game remaining. The final game, though, in Paris was in front of local crowds and was one of the biggest and most jovial crowds, as it was reported as 25,000 fans showed up to see Texas A&I win 21-13. Most, if not all, of the fans were kind of like the Japanese crowd that I talked about in the previous episode, where they were just really more interested in seeing this new game and also seeing the giant athletes that played this game. And because many of the locals really didn't know what was going on, they didn't see the utter statistical domination that Texas A&I had, as they had an average of 321 yards per game during this series, while holding Henderson State to 165 yards a game. They also had 7 yards per carry on this trip too, which is just crazy, and their defense was spectacular as they gave up less than 150 yards per game. But even though this series was seen as a very good thing for both schools, the NAIA, and the IFL, it didn't help the IFL, as the IFL obviously never happened because you don't really know anything about it. NFL Europe would come into existence, but in about 2 decades after this. There wouldn't be another European Cup planned, nor would there be any more games coming to Germany until 1992, just after the unification of the country. And actually, the next game to come to Europe didn't come until 1988, as it was played in the United Kingdom between 2 Division III NCAA schools. But in closing, there are a lot of games that have been played in Europe since then, over a dozen or so, and actually there was a game that happened in Ireland just this past year, and there's going to be more in the future, so maybe there will be another European Cup that will come in the future. We'll just have to wait and see, and also see if the NCAA wants to collect on some of this European money now. But thank you so much for hanging out with me as we go through another international journey in college football first, where we check out the first games that happened overseas. If you like this video, please share it with other college football fans. And as always, like this channel. Make sure you subscribe to the channel below, like this video, of course. And you can check out my Patreon, where you can help out the channel, my podcast, and my social media in the description below. Have a fantastic rest of your day.